Good morning and good evening, ladies and gentlemen. I'm Saurabh Gupta from the Institute for China-America Studies, and welcome to our latest TNT event. It's called Of Guardrails and Floors, the Biden-Xi meeting and the outlook for U.S. China relations and the Taiwan question. I am pinch hitting in terms of introducing the event in place of my executive director, Ms. Nong Hong. She's a little bit under the weather, so I am taking her up her role as an introducer of the program, and I will be the moderator of the program too. Just as a very brief introduction, after, 5 phone calls and 2 virtual meetings, President Biden and President Xi finally had an in-person meeting in Bali on November 14th. The meeting seemed to go off well. It seemed to at least provide some sort of a platform of stability to bilateral relations. Prior to that, we had the 20th Party Congress, where obviously we had what looks like a centralization of power in President Xi. For his part, President Biden came out reasonably well from the midterm election. It was a bruising election, but he did fairly. The Democrats seem to hold their own, although the Republicans do have the House of Representatives, and we will see whether that brings a certain additional degree of instability or not to U.S.-China ties. That is what is the thrust of our discussion going forward for the next 80 minutes. We have 4 terrific speakers out here. Some of you all are familiar with Dr. Yawei and with Denis Simon. They've been on our events before. Even Dr. Robert Sutter, who's done tremendous amount of work in this space, has been on our program before, not on a TNT event before, but he's been at our annual conference before. But for Dr. Zhiqun, another prolific author and professor, this is his first appearance at our event, and I want to thank him and thank all the panelists for their availability and for their insight going forward. I am going to step away from at this point of time. I'm going to allow the panelists to take the floor and lead the discussion. In terms of speaking order, we are going to have Dr. Yawei speak first. He's going to provide a table setter of the 20th Party Congress, followed by Dr. Sutter, followed by Dr. Zhu, giving international relations perspectives, both from the U.S. perspective and the Chinese perspective on U.S.-China relations, including how the impact it might have on the Taiwan question. And finally, we'll have Professor Simon speaking with regard to his area of core specialization, which has been S&T ties. And may I say, Professor Denis Simon has been in Beijing very recently and has had conversations in this regard. So I think it will be a very, very useful conversation. Let me very briefly introduce Dr. Yawei Liu. You all already have it in the brochure, in the poster. Let me just say that Dr. Liu has been involved with following Chinese politics for a long time, including at the grassroots level. He has written extensively on China's political developments and grassroots democracy, including 3 edited book series. He is founder and editor of the China Elections and Governance website, www.chinaelections.org, and he is an adjunct professor of political science at Emory University. So without any further ado, the floor is yours, Dr. Yawei.
Thanks, Gupta, for that introduction. I don't know if I can set the table. What I want to do is just, the takeaways from the Party Congress, as well as a very quick overview of the midterm election and how that is going to impact the relationship. But I have to start by saying that Jiang Zemin passed away last night. And, the death of Chinese leaders in the past, in January 1976, Zhou Enlai passed away. And then in September 1976, Mao passed away. In April 1989, Hu Yaobang passed away. And all these deaths led to tremendous changes in China. Whether this untimely or timely death is going to create any changes or opening of changes, we don't know. But this is certainly something for all of us and our audience, to ponder on why, in a country like China, a death of a leader, which shouldn't be a catalyst for anything, but has always been a catalyst for changes, in recent Chinese history. Now back to the 20th Party Congress. I think the first takeaway I have from reading the political report and what happened after the Party Congress is it is clear that China still wants to stabilize and if possible to improve relationship with the United States, because China wants to modernize, and having a stable and mutually beneficial relationship with the United States is a very important part of the modernization drive of China. I think if you compare this political report to the political report of the 19th Party Congress, this one seems to be more aware of China's dire international situation. I remember, I was in China during the 19th Party Congress. They were talking about China was moving to the center of the global stage of everything. But this report, basically, you hear a lot more about the challenges, particularly security challenges China is being confronted now. And I think people sometimes say we're not going to take this kind of report seriously, because saying things is one thing, whether these things are going to be implemented is another. But I think for the Westerners, other countries, it should hold China accountable to what was expressed in the political report. And of course, in this report, as in many other previous reports, China once again said, we're never going to be a hegemony. We're not going to be jingoistic or try to expand beyond China proper. I think these are the things that have to be observed, and also in future conversations with the Chinese leaders, you should always raise these issues. This is what you said, but look at what you have done and what you're going to do. We all have a report card at our heart. So that's the first takeaway, is that China wants to stabilize the relationship. China still wants to be, if not a leader, but at least the defender of globalization. China wants to see a more multipolar world, and to use the cliche used by the Chinese is the so-called democratization of international relations. So that's the first takeaway. The second takeaway, I think, is what people have talked about the centralization of the power. I mean, there are all kinds of interpretations of what this means. I think if we look at this, is at least right now, there's not much difference at the top. So you have a central leader, and then you have all people who are his people. And we were just told by a China scholar saying, you don't even know how much President Xi Jinping, how much attention President Xi Jinping pays to the stability of the bilateral relationship. I think that's good. If he sees this relationship as the most important, the most vital one, all the others are going to echo his view. So at the top, I think it's going to be a very quick and easy decision process. And as we look at now, as Sarab mentioned, the January 14th meeting, the signal is clear. He wants this relationship to be stable. He wants to improve the relationship. He wants to work with President Biden and other Western leaders to find common ground. I think, at least in the short period of time, this is going to be the main thrust of the Chinese foreign policy. Number three is the foreign policy leadership core. I think we'll see continuation, because personnel, our policy, Wang Yi is going to stay on, and Chinese ambassador to the U.S., he's going to be the new foreign minister. So you have that core who is very knowledgeable about U.S. China relationship, who are veterans, and unlike sort of outcome of an election, particularly a presidential election, the entire foreign policy team, in the U.S. or other countries are going to change. This is not going to change in China. Finally, I think on the issue of Taiwan, you read the section on Taiwan, my personal view is there is no significant change on the language. There is no timetable. You know, there is the emphasis on the prospect of a peaceful resolution of the cross-strait situation. But there is also the emphasis that, you know, we're not going to denounce the use of force, but using of the force is not going to target the people in Taiwan. I think the most important message, as far as I'm concerned, is that resolution of the Taiwan issue is something that only ethnic Chinese can and should be able to resolve. I think if the Chinese leaders stick to this conviction that, you know, the issue across the strait has to be handled and eventually resolved by the people on the mainland as well as in China, then you can pretty much ignore, you know, other noises in the chamber, so you can focusing on what does it take for ethnic Chinese from two sides to come together. And of course, you know, I think these rhetorics are basically reflected in the meetings after the party congress. You know, President Xi traveled to Bali, he traveled to Bangkok, he met, you know, close to 20 leaders from different countries. And of course, the most important one is the one that took place on January the 14th. You know, we're talking about the guardrails, we're talking about the floors. And after and before that, you know, there are other meetings. She also met with Vice President Harris. The Chinese defense minister met with the U.S. Secretary of Defense, and John Kerry met with his counterpart in Egypt during COP 26, 27. So all the flurry of meetings that are taking place, and of course, Secretary Blinken will travel to China. So we see this, you know, the phone calls that Saurabh, you mentioned, 5 phone calls, didn't really lead to a flurry of activities, you know, as this meeting. So this in-person meeting is really important. So that's my takeaway. One is the party congress is not that sort of, you know, it's not a different. The Chinese policy, there are different emphases, but the main threat in terms of foreign policy, in terms of U.S. China relationship is going to be the same. And this, again, has been reflected in the meetings after that. Now, on the midterm election, I just want to sort of in 1 minute quickly go through. Number one is GOP does have a very small majority. It doesn't have total control of legislative and oversight agenda, but it's going to make things more difficult for the relationship, particularly once it starts investigating President Biden and particularly his son, Hunter Biden. You know, that's going to stir up a lot of dirt that will be related to U.S. China relationship. Secondly, of course, you know, people are talking about the new presumptuous speaker, Kevin McCarthy. You know, he may go to Taiwan, and will that lead to another crisis? I think also if President Biden is going to see Congress less easy or more difficult to work with, he may spend more time focusing on foreign policy. So I see 2023 as the most important year in terms of bilateral relationship, because once you get into 2024 with the primary for the presidential election going, it's going to be very difficult to do anything. So I'm hoping that in 2023, there will be a reset of the relationship. The challenge is how do you turn words into actions? You know, what is the guardrail, and how are you going to set up the floor? You know, are you going to say we set up the floor, but the floor keeps sinking? And that's going to be a problem. So I'll stop here and I'll participate in the Q&A. Thank you. Back to you, Saurabh.
Thank you, Yawei. Yeah, I think your point is well taken with regard to stability in foreign policy, especially because if I'm not mistaken, the only two people, folks, apart from President Xi, for whom the age norm was relaxed is Wang Yi and the gentleman who's going to become the CMC vice chairman, because those were the only two for which the age limits were relaxed. And that's a sign that, at least on that front, there's more preference for continuity. Thank you, Yawei. Next, we're going to go with Professor Robert Sutter. Dr. Sutter is Professor of Practice of International Affairs at the Elliott School of George Washington University. He has served previously as National Intelligence Officer for East Asia and the Pacific at the U.S. government's National Intelligence Council. He's published 22 books, loads and loads of articles with great insight on Asian geopolitics, particularly on the Taiwan issue. And I personally have been fortunate to be his student in his class. I'm really looking forward to your presentation, Dr. Sutter. The floor is yours.
Well, thank you so much for the very nice introduction. I really, it's a great pleasure for me to be here and to speak with you today about an American perspective, particularly on the Biden-Xi meeting. I certainly agree with Professor Liu that this is a turning point of some consequence. The situation publicly, as far as the Chinese leaders and diplomats are concerned, is quite different than what it was before the Biden-Xi meeting. Things were tough. And my starting off point here is what I see as a compromise, a significant compromise by the Chinese side to drop all their preconditions for the talks between the United States and China on guardrails. They were blocking this for over a year. The Biden administration was seeking this. And I think people in Washington who deal with policy toward China are paying attention to this sort of thing, even though it isn't getting a lot of media attention. Because the Chinese government generally doesn't make compromises like this. You find in Washington, dealing with China over the last 5 years, we've had what we call the Washington Consensus, what some call, and I call it, the Washington Consensus, made up of bipartisan majorities in Congress and the administration leaders working constructively to defend America on what they see as major challenges, very significant dangers coming from China. So will this process change as a result of what's been happening? I think this is quite significant. And what I see is, looking back, you say, if you're a policymaker, you say, well, the Chinese are shifting a bit here. What's causing it? Well, let's look at our policies. Are we causing this? And what you see is ever more toughening in US policy toward China. The Washington Consensus is having a banner year in Washington in 2022. We find big bills like the Chips and Science Act, $250 billion for competing with China, the climate change provisions of the Inflation Act, $365 billion for climate change issues that we'll see how they impact China. And there's a lot of anti-China provisions in that act. And of course, the administration's very harsh restrictions on computer chip technology to China. So these are just three of the most recent things that have happened. And these are sort of landmarks, and there are all sorts of other things that have gone on. And then we have Taiwan. And here in Taiwan, we had about 3 weeks of debate. It was pretty active over the Pelosi visit and the Chinese exercises and surrounding Taiwan for 4 days of exercises. This was a lot of discussion. What happened afterward? Look at what happened afterward. Nothing changed. It went forward. Mr. Biden, his administration went forward with new arms sales. It went forward patrols in the Taiwan Strait. Went forward with a new economic agreement moving toward a new economic agreement with Taiwan. And the president said what he said about Taiwan, you're all familiar with. And so, and then the Congress doubled down as well. And so what's the implication? The implication is this pressure works. This pressure makes China more accommodating. This is part of those bad situations that Professor Liu was talking about that the Chinese have to deal with. And so will you reduce the pressure now at this point? I think not, because the Washington consensus people seem to think there's a whole bunch of other things that need to be done before the US is effectively defended against the challenges coming from China. Added to this is something that I think is worthy of consideration. These are international circumstances that where the US is not targeting China, but nonetheless, these have a very strong impact on China and build those negative circumstances that China faces that Professor Liu was talking about. The first one is Ukraine. Here, the Biden government is bringing together an ever-broadening coalition to counter Russia and its aggression in Ukraine and all the negative consequences that come from that: energy, food, and the use of nuclear weapons. Those are some of the consequences. And it's very successful. It's growing in importance. And it highlights what? It highlights that from the critics' point of view, that the main international enabler of Putin's actions is China. And this has had a big impact in Europe, as we know. NATO has switched its view of China. It's now seen as the main danger, along with Russia. The European Union has changed similarly, and many European powers have done the same. So the US has the capacity to continue to move in this direction, and it will. It is continuing this, and this will be detrimental to China. The second area, and this is not targeting China, it just will happen. The second area is climate change. And what the administration has done in climate change is change America's policies. It's now a leader in dealing with this issue constructively. And this implicitly puts the spotlight on China as ever more using coal, its largest source of energy, and using more of it ever more as the world's biggest emitter. And of course, and Xi Jinping didn't go to the COP27. And in fact, he cut off the ties with Kerry as a result of the Pelosi visit. So this kind of situation is something where the US can use its importance in this area in ways that will complicate China's situation internationally that Professor Liu alluded to. And the third area is COVID. The Biden administration has been effective in COVID. The country is vaccinated. And the situation is under control, and we are increasingly immune. And so normalcy is returning to America as in economic situation and in social situations. And China is on the other end of the spectrum right now. They have the problems that are in the headlines today. And there's no easy way out. So the US again can emphasize its situation, its leadership in COVID, and doesn't have to say anything about China, but it's obvious what's going to happen. The point I'm getting at here is the Washington consensus has been working hard for 5 years trying to get the Chinese to compromise, to get them to stop doing the things that they're doing to challenge the United States. And they haven't done this. Maybe the trade negotiations under Trump were emblematic of something, but in retrospect, that's a negative experience from the United States point of view. And so the point is, what do you do to get them to compromise? What do you do to get them to do substantive things? There's nothing substantive yet about what Professor Liu was talking about. This is all atmospherics at this point. But if this continues, I think what we're going to see is that the United States is going to decide that they got to keep up the pressure. And I think this is a foregone conclusion anyway, because we're going to have legislation, the Foreign Affairs, the National Defense Authorization Act is full of, reportedly, is full of all anti-China provisions. The Biden administration is preparing, reportedly, is preparing to impose restrictions on US financial investment in China. And Professor Liu has already alluded to the various tactics that are going to be implemented by the new Republican majority in the House of Representatives. So going forward, I think the US side is going to continue to struggle. It's going to see it's in a good position. And if it wants to be deft about this, it can apply pressure indirectly in those 3 areas that I mentioned. And there's one other. Do I have time for one other? I'm not sure. There's one other that Mr. Biden really has strengths and Xi Jinping doesn't. Mr. Biden is an approachable leader who's capable of flexible interaction with people that don't agree with him. He showed this at the G20 and his summits in meeting with the Egyptian leader, with Hun Sen, as well as Erdogan of Turkey and others. And the result is he builds these international coalitions on Ukraine and many other issues as well. And he does it effectively. Mr. Xi, and does it because he has personal relationships with these people. He knows them and they know him, and they seem to get along okay. Mr. Xi Jinping has a real disadvantage here. He's been hibernating for 3 years, and his approach is aloof. The China Daily says at the G20, he was working the crowd. Well, maybe he was schmoozing at that time, but basically that isn't his approach, and he tends to be pretty severe. So the upshot here is that Mr. Biden, I think, is in a strong position. He doesn't look like a strong leader, but as far as dealing with China is concerned, I think he has a lot of strength. So I will stop here and look forward to other discussions.
Thank you, Professor Sutter. That was very helpful. And I think it needs to be redoubled and said about the depth of the bilateral consensus here on China. Even during the Trump years, yes, the trade war went sideways, but they did pass the evolved CFIUS Act, which was the FIRMA, the Foreign Investment Modernization Act, that was done completely on a bilateral basis. And then even what has happened in terms of Inflation Reduction Act and the CHIPS Act, they've all been and the Bilateral Infrastructure Act have all been bipartisan. And I think the depth of that is not fully perhaps understood at the Chinese end, because it's about gaps between the Republicans, and yes, the Republicans are hard aligned, but the extent of bilateral consensus, I think, which you flagged, I think is a very important point. Thank you, Dr. Sutter. Next, we will go to Professor Zhiqun Zhu. Welcome to our ICAS for the first time to our ICAS event. Hope to have you for many more ICAS events down the line. He is Professor of Political Science and International Relations at Bucknell University, and he has been an International Relations Department Chair there. He's been an editor of a dozen books, received many research fellowships and grants. In fact, he just published recently a 3-volume book on the geopolitics and geoeconomics of the Indo-Pacific. We're looking forward to hearing your views, Professor Zhu.
Thank you, Saurabh, for your kind invitation and introduction. It's really a great pleasure to be part of this panel. I was asked to sort of present the Chinese perspective, right, on the summit and U.S. China relations and the Taiwan issue. I admire Professor Sutter. You did an excellent job in presenting the U.S. perspective. I'm not sure whether I can, to what extent I can present the Chinese perspective, because as you know, I'm based in central Pennsylvania and I haven't been to China for over 3 years. So what I can do is perhaps to offer my own observation, which may include some of the Chinese views that I picked up from reading the Chinese sources on the Biden summit, Biden-Xi summit, and the U.S. China relations in general. So in 10 minutes, I'm going to cover 3 issues, right? First, the Biden-Xi summit. I think overall the summit went pretty well, and perhaps even better than expected, since both sides had very low expectations before the summit. The atmosphere was cordial, and the 2 leaders shook hands with broad smiles. The opening remarks by the 2 leaders really set the positive tone for the talks. President Xi said China does not intend to challenge the international order or to replace the US leadership. President Biden said a stable and developed China is in the interest of the United States and the world. Those are very positive comments. By all indications, the conversation was candid, in-depth, and perhaps even pleasant. And both leaders were respectful and serious at the same time. Looking at the happy faces of Biden and Xi when they shook hands, I cannot help comparing the image with another famous handshake between Xi Jinping and the late Japanese Prime Minister Shinzo Abe in 2014, the Beijing APEC summit, when Xi Jinping and Shinzo Abe did not even hide their dislike for each other. So this time around, I think Biden and Xi did pretty well, showing respect and friendship. Indeed, if you look at, if you only hear the opening remarks or only read the Chinese readout, you may think that everything seems hunky-dory, right? And what Biden said, as reported in the Chinese readout, is almost music to Beijing's ears. He said, for example, the United States respects China's political system, does not seek to change China's system, does not seek a new Cold War, and does not seek to confront China through strengthening alliances. He also said the United States does not intend to decouple from China and does not intend to block China's development or contain China. By the way, none of these things that Biden said above was included in the White House readout about the summit. So we have to put the two readouts together to get sort of a complete picture. And that complete picture about the relationship is not rosy. The reality is the two countries are engaged in a cutthroat competition. And I think the White House readout said that the US would continue to compete vigorously with China. And it did not mention Biden's remarks about not supporting two Chinas or one China, one Taiwan. Instead, it says Biden raised objections to Beijing's assertive and increasingly aggressive actions towards Taiwan. So clearly, all the existing problems between the two sides are still there. And one meeting will not solve all the problems. But as Winston Churchill once said, to jaw is always better than to war. Like Biden himself also said, we're not going to be able to work everything out. I'm not going to suggest this is kumbaya, right? Still, given the terrible state of relationship in the past few years, this meeting, I think, is very significant in terms of setting the guardrails and building the floors to arrest the further deterioration of the relationship. One of the positive things, outcomes that is that the resumption of dialogue between the two sides, including climate change and military affairs. So even baby steps are significant for improving the relationship. It is clear that the two leaders understand difficulties as well as the importance of the relationship, and both seem to be committed to maintaining the relationship and to avoid conflict. So in this sense, I think the Biden-Xi summit helps lower tensions and rebuild the trust between the two sides. So that's the first point. Second point, the U.S.-China relations in general. I think we have to be clear-eyed and not carried away by this relatively friendly meeting, because tensions are still there. Although they may have been eased to some extent, all the structural problems and divisive issues are still there. This is and will be a difficult relationship. I would suggest that let's call a spade and spade. President Biden has gone even further than Trump in terms of competing with China and countering China's global influence. Everyone can see it. I think people in China do not like it, but perhaps they can live with it. However, when Biden says, we do not intend to block China's development, I think people in China will wonder, are you serious? How about that sweeping high-tech exports ban to China as an example? Just days before the CCP's 20-party Congress, the White House published the 2022 National Security Strategy, which identifies China as the only competitor that has both the intent and power to challenge US dominance. And the goal of US strategy is to outcompete China. So it is interesting to note that Biden proposed the in-person meeting with Xi. Perhaps the Biden administration, or at least President Biden himself, has come to realize that the US will not be able to bring China to its knees through the trade war, the high-tech war, or diplomatic sanctions. The two powers will have to find a way to coexist, even if they don't like each other. I'm not sure, is this a change of heart or just a change of tactic? Now, Xi Jinping has been portrayed so negatively in the Western media, and it's really mind-boggling to see Biden and other Western leaders eager to meet with Xi now. Shortly before the Biden-Xi summit, the United States held its midterm elections, and it has been mentioned by Yawei and SUTTER, right? Democratic Party fared better than expected, which perhaps helped strengthen Biden's hand in diplomacy, including dealing with China. But before too long, the United States will enter the presidential election season, when China will predictably become the punching bag of most, if not all, candidates. On the other hand, Xi Jinping has become more confident after 20th Party Congress. Despite some problems related to the zero COVID policy, including recent protests in several cities across China, Xi's position at home seems secure, which is helpful as he reemerges onto the world stage. Xi's activities at the G20 and APEC represented his remarkable return to the global stage. The fact that the Western leaders were lining up to meet with him will only boost Xi's domestic and international stature. So right now, we have a very small window of opportunity to improve bilateral relations. If not grasped, this opportunity will be gone soon. It's encouraging that Western leaders seemed ready to re-engage with Xi Jinping now, and Xi seemed confident and prepared to present a new image abroad for himself and for China. So both China and the West seem to be recalibrating their approaches towards each other. I think that's good news, really. President Xi even urged US allies to retain their strategic autonomy and stay clear of the influence of third parties without naming the United States. So this divide and rule strategy resonate with the thinking in some Western capitals. So looks like the Western United Front against China is cracking. It's not coincidence that before the Xi-Biden summit, German Chancellor Olaf Scholz visited Beijing, becoming the first Western leader to meet with Xi after 20th Party Congress. And more recently, of course, the Dutch foreign trade minister said the United States cannot dictate other countries' exports to China in response to sweeping high-tech ban to China imposed by the United States. The Biden administration has also portrayed the U.S.-China relationship as that between democracy and autocracy. The Chinese would point out this is hypocritical because the United States practices democracy and promotes diversity at home, but in international affairs, the United States is not democratic at all and does not respect diversity either. President Biden said the United States and China must manage their competition responsibly. But how? Unfortunately, what we see is basically a zero-sum competition. It's a tall order, if not completely impossible, to prevent competition from veering into conflict. So the two leaders have tried to place some flaw under the relationship. But how firm is that flaw? Only time can tell. But I don't think a lot of people are optimistic about the relationship in the years ahead. Now, very quickly, final point about Taiwan. I think we all know that Taiwan issue is front and center at the U.S.-China relationship. Xi Jinping said Taiwan is at the core of China's core interests, and Taiwan is the first red line that the United States cannot and must not cross. I think this is the first time that the Chinese leader has made such a clear and public statement on Taiwan. Having said that the United States will help defend Taiwan 4 times, I think Biden was trying to give the Chinese some reassurance during the Biden-Xi summit. That's why, in addition to saying that the United States does not support Taiwan independence, Biden also said the United States does not support two Chinas or one China, one Taiwan. Now, this is really similar to what the President Bill Clinton said in Shanghai, 1998. So the United States also opposes unilateral changes to the status quo. But what is the status quo across the Taiwan Strait? Who defines the status quo? And who is changing the status quo? I think one can easily point out that all 3 parties, Washington, Beijing, and Taipei, have changed or are attempting to change the status quo. For example, the United States recently modified its interpretation of One China by adding the previously private promises to Taiwan, the 6 assurances to America's definition of One China, beyond the traditional definition based on the Taiwan Relations Act and the 3 joint communiques. And of course, the DPP, the ruling party in Taipei, considers Taiwan an independent country, not part of the same country together with the mainland, as stipulated by the ROC Constitution, and is still followed by KMT. And on the mainland, the modernization of the People's Liberation Army has broken the military balance across the Taiwan Strait. And more recently, of course, Beijing has decided to disregard the middle line of the Taiwan Strait, which it tacitly honored before. So despite Biden's reaffirmation of America's One China policy, in Beijing's view, Washington's words and deeds do not match. Beijing believes that Washington is hollowing out the substance of One China. And of course, we know Congress has been passing bill after bill to upgrade U.S.-Taiwan relations. No wonder the Chinese are skeptical of Washington's One China commitment. Now, very briefly, looking ahead, the Taiwan issue, I think, will remain a major source of conflict between the United States and China. It was mentioned earlier also that next 12, maybe 18 months will be a period of great uncertainty or even danger. Kevin McCarthy may visit Taiwan sometime next year. And if he goes, and it will come so soon after Pelosi's visit, Beijing will definitely consider it as a deliberate provocation. The other day, National Security Council Strategic Communication Coordinator John Kirby actually said members of the Speaker of the House and other members of Congress have the right to travel abroad, including Taiwan. Apparently, the Biden administration is not going to do anything about a potential McCarthy visit to Taiwan. Too often we are told that Congress and the White House are different branches of the government. But that explanation is not particularly helpful, nor is it very convincing in international relations. First of all, domestic politics, specifically checks and balances, should not be used to justify inconsistency or contradictions in US foreign policy. Yes, indeed, Congress is a separate branch of the US government, but it is the part of the same government which is represented by the president in foreign affairs. The president's policy is the official policy. Any departure from it is a violation. Secondly, the Biden administration has often talked about the rules-based international order. Well, I think the rule here is that the United States only maintains unofficial relations with Taiwan, and that has been part of the international order for over 40 years. If the White House is serious about the rule-based international order, then it should do more. Try everything possible to prevent, congressional leaders from visiting Taiwan in their official capacity. The DPP, we know, did not do well in the just concluded local elections in Taiwan, but it may come back in the 2024 presidential election, because we all know that DPP is pretty good at electioneering at the presidential level. The DPP also portrays itself as the only party that can resist pressure from the PRC and defend Taiwan's democracy. I think many Taiwanese voters who supported the KMT candidates this time around may turn to support the DPP in 2024. And most importantly, I think the United States seems to favor the DPP. So the storms will be gathering over the Taiwan Strait again very soon. We'll need to fasten our seatbelts and brace for the turbulence ahead. Sorry to be so pessimistic. I'll stop here.
Thank you for your wide-ranging comments, Dr. Zhu. I think it's important the point that to emphasize the point that we need to be clear-eyed about the structural problems that are in the relationship despite the meeting having gone well. And I found it intriguing that you talked about finding ways to coexist, because just like from the 1972 onwards, there was a very productive strategic engagement. Obviously, that old normal does not exist, but there is perhaps space for over the next 25 years to flesh out what coexistence might mean in U.S. China relations, and that is in the hands of diplomacy. So we'll have to see how this goes forward. Our final speaker is Dr. Denis Simon. I think he has a lot of interesting things to say because he has been in Beijing recently and spent quite some time out there. And has had very productive, useful conversations. Denis, as many of you all might know, is a senior advisor to the Trade and Technology Program. He's been very kind to us and has been very helpful to us, and we are very appreciative of that. Denis currently is the senior advisor to the President for China Affairs at Duke and professor of China Business and Technology at Duke's Fuqua School of Business. He's been awarded the China National Friendship Award by Premier Wen Jiabao. And prior to his return to Duke, he served as the executive vice chancellor at Duke Kunshan University in China. Denis, the floor is yours. Please go right ahead.
Thanks very much. It's always good to be on one of these sessions because so many provocative and important ideas get exchanged. I'm going to shift gears a little bit and talk about things perhaps from the bottom up rather than the top down. I spent an entire month from mid-October to mid-November in China. 17 of those days were in quarantine and 14 of the days were working days. But nonetheless, it gives you some very, very deep insights into what's going on. And let me make an opening comment about the quarantine first, and then we can get into some more substantive issues about the S&T relationship. I agree with the sentiment that's been expressed. Right now, China is between a rock and a hard place, particularly for the leadership in terms of what to do next. Clearly, some errors were committed early on, not sufficient vaccines for the elderly, and most important, not allowing imported vaccines from Pfizer, Moderna, and other companies to make their way into the country. And that means that most of the population doesn't have the level of immunity that we would hope it to have. Only 65% of the population above 80 years old has been vaccinated and with 2 shots, and only 40% have been vaccinated with 3 shots. So right now, the potential for a real explosion in COVID outbreaks really does exist. And we must remember one thing. In the United States, we have about 50 doctors per 10,000 population. China has 1.48 doctors per 10,000 population. So China was never going to take the same approach that the United States adopted. There was always going to be something unique and different about the way China approached it because of the vulnerability of their healthcare system. And if we saw the spiking that occurred in the U.S. between June 2020 and April 2021, where our own healthcare system was put under great pressure and stress, one wonders what would happen to the Chinese healthcare system, in fact, if it experienced that same kind of substantial increase in COVID cases. So I think the lockdown, it's very hard to, as an American, to understand it and to appreciate it. But on the other hand, sometimes you play yourself into a corner, and a lot of people, I think, now have found themselves with not many options, and something that we need to recognize. Well, one thing is really clear, and that is that the lockdown is making itself felt in economic terms. I usually, when I lived in China and went to Beijing, I went shopping at a place called the Pearl Market, and many of foreigners, expats, tourist groups go shopping there. And I went on a Saturday morning. Saturday morning at the Pearl Market used to be wall-to-wall people, tourist groups, expats, foreigners, et cetera, When I was there on that Saturday morning, there were no more than 10 customers in the whole Pearl Market. That's just an amazing situation when one recognizes that was one of the hotspots for shopping. And we can see that when I got into the street after my 17 days of quarantine, restaurants, shopping malls, tourist sites, etc., as well as the stories we're hearing about what's going on in factories and office buildings. These are all now succumbing to the effects of these lockdown, and obviously creating great damage to the economy. We also must remember that in 2018, there were about 11,000 U.S. students studying Chinese language and other parts of Chinese studies in China. In fall of 2022, I was told by a U.S. embassy official, there are less than 400 U.S. students now in China. This portends perhaps a major crisis for Chinese studies in the United States, with fewer and fewer students, willing to go to China because of the news coming out about lockdowns, etc. What's going to happen to the next generation of developing, people who really understand China if these young people are not willing to invest the time and the effort how will they get trained? So this is something we also need to think about. My trip was organized and hosted by CASTED, the Chinese Academy of Science and Technology for Economic Development. This is the most important think tank under the Ministry of Science and Technology. It's they made a major investment, and I made a major investment in preparing all of the documentation to go. It took over 18 months for us to get everything in place. We tried 3 times to organize the trip. And then finally in July, August, all the visas and paperwork were approved. And we decided come hell or high water, October was going to be the time for my travel to China. It turned out that I arrived on October 15th and sat down in my quarantine room so that on the 16th, I could spend all day watching the opening of the 20th Party Congress and Xi Jinping's opening speech and all of the commentary, not only on the Chinese media, but also on the Asia-related media that was allowed to come in through my TV system. I gave 5 talks when I was there, 5 official talks on U.S. China S&T relations, innovation policy, international S&T diplomacy, and also trends in the global innovation system. And I have to say that I've been going to China for 40 years. So these were some of the most frank, some of the most direct discussions that I've had about U.S.-China relations. Everything came on the table. And it might be interesting for me to highlight 6 or 7 of the big questions that I was asked repeatedly during my interactions. First of all, there was a great desire to understand where is U.S. policy headed? What is the end game that the Biden administration is seeking to achieve? And is this really about the total containment of China? And I want to highlight an article by John Bateman in Foreign Policy in October, in which he's made the argument that this is no longer simply about semiconductors, but it's more about a comprehensive attempt to slow down China's transition to a high-tech economy. I think the Chinese are wondering, in fact, if that is the case. And a number of people had read that article and were familiar with it and raised its contents with me. A second question is, what has happened to all of the mutually beneficial results that came from our cooperation? Like, for example, the clean energy research centers that were set up a number of years ago. We've had 40 years of cooperation that at least I know, they said we benefited, and we assumed that the United States was benefiting. Where has all that gone? Why is that all dissipated? And how well familiar is the Congress, the American public, about the achievements that have been obtained from that cooperation? A third question that came up is about the future of the government-to-government bilateral agreement in science and technology, which was first signed in 1979. It's gotten renewed. Its last renewal was in 2018, but it was done under the cover of darkness without any fanfare during the Trump administration. And there is a question what's going to happen in 2023. And is that important if it gets renewed or doesn't get renewed? A fourth question is about pushback. People kept asking me, okay, Professor Simon, you are a voice, asking for a more balanced approach. Where are the other people? Why is there no pushback in the Beltway about these kinds of things? And I think Bob alluded to the so-called Washington consensus, but I think people are wondering, we hear about in the heartland of the United States that the farmers have a separate interest in Washington, that people on the West Coast or another group of interested parties, they have a different perspective. Why aren't these voices being heard in the policy-making process back in Washington, D.C.? A fifth question was, we don't understand President Biden. Our expectation was that he would do something very different than Trump, and yet he seems to not only have embraced Trump's policies, but as we've heard, he's gone beyond those Trump policies. What is he trying to achieve that is different from Trump? Does he have an even more negative perspective about China than President Trump had? Then the sixth question was about people-to-people diplomacy, and particularly about universities. What has happened to the close ties between Chinese and American universities? Do U.S. universities really want to push back on receiving Chinese students? And what about the collaborative research that was being done among many, many universities? Is that something that U.S. wants to see come to an end? And so that was asked. And then the last question was, of course, I was there during the midterm elections, so they were looking very seriously to an interpretation of what all that meant. And we've heard some commentary from my colleagues on the panel about this. But you have to remember, this all took place before the meeting between President Xi and President Biden. And it also took place before, for example, as Professor Zhu mentioned, countries like Holland indicated that they're not going to necessarily follow in step with U.S. policy. And so, there is some sense that the solidarity that seemed to be among the Western alliance perhaps may not be as solid. Many of the people that I met over the course of the 14 working days that I was there, and by the way, I did give a couple of webinars over Zoom or VUV, which is the 10-cent version of Zoom. I've known these people for 20, in some cases 30 years. And so our discussions continue to be rather candid, rather honest, and very, very sincere. And I talked to them very frankly. I decided that I was going to be rather explicit, and I talked particularly about Chinese rule-breaking behaviors. That sure, China's success as a result of reform and opening up may be one of the key causal factors, but there's a perception in the United States that China has not been playing by by the rules. And in particular, I talked about 4 or 5 things: IPR theft, cyber hacking, industrial spying, non-compliance with WTO commitments, and assertion of political influence domestically within the United States. And I said to them, do you have any recommendations about how we can deal with these issues, because they are of major concern to many Americans? And I cited to them the Pew surveys indicating that some 82% of Americans have a negative image of China. And so, they didn't have an answer, frankly, other than on the IP issue to indicate that, of course, China's IP policies have been improving, as has the enforcement, and that is all true. I think the thrust of my visit is that there's no replacement for face-to-face conversations to discuss some of these very difficult issues. And so that's why, for example, the meeting between President Xi and President Biden was so important. In-person conversation cannot be replaced by Zoom meetings. And I was very impressed by the openness, whether we were in big session with 40 or 50 people, or we were in smaller groups of 5 or 6 people. The conversations were all very much to the point and very, very direct. CASTED, as I mentioned, is the key policy think tank for the Ministry of Science and Technology. And one of the things that was interesting, they brought into the room during one of our meetings the people of a brand new institute. And that institute was to deal with international S&T relations. This was, for me, something that I had seen on an evolving path, the growing interest in S&T diplomacy in China, as China seeks to get much more involved in international global governance regarding S&T issues. And creating this new institute, even though the team is fairly young, they're working on a very, quick learning curve. And I think that they were particularly interested in how the United States trains our S&T diplomats. And I talked about the different starts and false starts in the State Department about creating an S&T cone and the role of the AAAS and the National Academy, about helping to establish a more stable pipeline for getting people with S&T knowledge into foreign service positions in U.S. embassies. Perhaps the most important meeting I had was with the Vice Minister of MOST, Vice Minister Li Meng, who also happens to head the Foreign Experts Bureau. You may recall the Guardrails Foreign Experts Bureau used to be a separate bureau, but it was merged into the Ministry of Science and Technology a few years ago. And because of work that I've done on talent issues, they had him, meet with me. And I would say that was a particularly frank exchange. There was a lot of discussion about the Chips and Science Act, and what that was going to mean in real terms. Was it just a boost, primarily a booster, for U.S. semiconductors, or did it really contain, in essence, all of the anti-China provisions that seem to be emerging in terms of the interpretation of what this is going to mean for U.S.-China relations? And the big question for them is that beyond semiconductors, are we going to see similar controls for bioscience, life sciences, and several other areas? And is that likely coming around the bend? And I said to them, from what I hear, the answer, unfortunately, is yes, there's more coming. And I think Bob and Zhiqun, indicated that that's what they see also. I suggested to them, at the end of the day, because, we were all kind of searching around for an options list. What do we do next? How can we, move the relationship to a more positive footing? And I suggested, well, what if we don't focus on a renewal of the 1979 agreement? What if, in fact, we talk about something called S&T Cooperation 2.0? And I raised the issue up front about whether or not we needed a new agreement that actually took into account all of these major problems and issues that we've encountered over the last 40 years, and each country make a rather significant commitment to repair and to fix these problems so that they don't impede cooperation over the next 40 years. And we also talked about, doing a better job in popularizing the successes that have been achieved over the last 40 years in our cooperation, because there's a feeling that particularly the American public and American politicians are not readily aware of what has been gone on. I think one of the biggest complaints that I heard from the trip, and I also included a visit with the U.S. Embassy people, the science counselor, head of the public affairs at the embassy as well. And I also had some meetings in Washington with people in the Chinese embassy before I had gone. And in all of those conversations, the one biggest complaint is the lack of communication and ongoing dialogue among the countries. U.S. Embassy people complained that they couldn't get appointments and meetings. Chinese embassy people in D.C. complained that they couldn't get appointments and meetings. And then everyone seemed to be kind of stuck in the mud in a way that they couldn't get themselves out of this because they just simply couldn't engage in dialogue and discussion about what was going on. So I think this is something that we need to recognize. It's very difficult to understand where things are going to go if we can't even sit down and talk about it. And so maybe one of the big icebreakers of that Xi-Biden meeting is to re-energize engagement in terms of dialogue and conversation. And I'm hoping that's the case. One of the things I also tried to flush out, which is I think also very interesting, and that is where in the Chinese government is the strategy to how to respond to all of this being organized. Is there an agency or a special leading group or some kind of entity that's been established in order to take on the task of not simply responding to the United States in terms of our bilateral relationship, but more importantly, how to respond to what Xi Jinping referred to in his speech as this harsher international environment that China is now facing. And one of my takeaways from the Xi Jinping speech was really his emphasis on the harsh nature of the world compared to the very globally oriented world that China entered when it opened up its doors. We are now, in fact, in a period of perhaps some calling deglobalization or fractured globalization, and how China is going to deal with that, because that's not the same user-friendly environment. And I think the Chinese themselves are trying to understand how quickly globalization may be being dismantled with the U.S. Policies in ascendancy. And I think that's something that also is really important. Now, my original purpose for the trip really was to gather some final data for a book that I'm writing called China's Evolving Role in the Global Innovation System. And 2 years ago, when this all began, I was fairly certain, and my co-author, Fan Pei Lei from Michigan State, were pretty certain about what we were going to say in the concluding chapter about China's evolving role. 2 years hence, as of today, and from my visit, both my Chinese counterparts and myself kind of walked away from this wondering what is, in fact, the trajectory for China's role in the global innovation system. And I think the Chinese themselves are trying to figure that out. I was curious about what they thought, but they were even more curious about what I thought. And I think that made for some very, very interesting discussions while I was there. So let me close with a little bit of perhaps even editorializing. I think there's been a lot of reporting in the U.S. media in particular that many China scholars in the United States may be hesitant about visiting China because of COVID, of lockdowns, the situation in Canada with the two Michaels, et cetera, and also, of course, the political tightening that has gone on under President Xi over the last couple of years. I would suggest that we need to do a better job about fixing that. We need to keep trying to go to China. We need to keep the lines of communication open and try to identify some quick wins where we can build more trust and build more confidence. I think everyone on this panel would agree that we reached a low point, and I'm hoping that Zhiqun is not right, in his ending that but I do agree in the short term things may get worse before they get better. And I think that that's something that we have to be on the lookout for. My fear is that we will enter a slippery slope, that we will begin to slide down that slope, and will take us a very, very long time to get back to some level in recovering where we had been, if we could ever get back there again. And that doesn't mean we let the Chinese off the hook for the things that these rule-breaking behaviors that I've said. But from a longer term perspective, again, it's something I constantly say, there is no global problem whose meaningful solution can be accomplished without close U.S.-China S&T cooperation. And so we need to be working together if there's any hope that climate change, clean energy, global pandemics, etc., have a chance to be addressed in an effective way if we're not talking and working together to solve those problems. And I'll stop there. Thank you.
Thank you, Denis, for your illuminating comments about your illuminating meetings in Beijing. One other point I was struck by was the fact that you were there in China, and that there was also thereafter, the business leaders also landed up in China, some of whom, like Mr. Craig Allen, U.S. China Business Council head, have been on our events before. And that was a kind of a signal coming out from the Chinese side that they really do want this communication and direct people-to-people communication and leader-led communication to go forward. And I hope that will be the norm going forward. We have a little under 10 minutes, perhaps 10 minutes for questions. We have a few questions in the question box. But before I come to those questions in the question box, I wanted to ask a question to Dr. Liu Yawei. And this is a little separate from what we've been discussing, and given your understanding and knowledge of Chinese politics, just tell us a little bit about what China should do on COVID going forward, and how you see the protest activity that is ongoing out there. Do they have any longer term ramifications, or what are your views on that front? Before I get to those other questions, I just wanted to pulse you on this one.
Thanks, Saurabh. I think in terms of how China is going to stick to or revise its current zero COVID approach, I think considering the protests that have taken place in different cities, I think the Chinese government should acknowledge that it had as Denis mentioned, have had earlier successes, but there are deficiencies and problems in the current approach. What are these deficiencies and shortcomings? And for example, should China have a more vigorous vaccination campaign, particularly among the more vulnerable population, as Denis mentioned? Should China start importing foreign vaccines and COVID drugs? And should China start punishing and disciplining those government officials and merchants that have benefited from zero COVID approach illegally? And I think the government should make it clear, one, this is come to an end, and under what conditions. I don't think the current policy can sustain itself forever, regardless of what Denis mentioned about the ratio between doctors and the population. If you look at countries like India and Brazil and other countries that probably have even more dire public health situations, have managed to coexist with COVID. What's wrong of China coming up with a solution to coexist with the virus? Otherwise, I don't know. The political and social cost of this policy is going to be such that even if China doesn't want to decouple from the rest of the world, the result is China will be decoupled from the rest of the world.
Let me come to the questions which are listed out. You can hear me, right? Yeah. Yeah. Let me come to the questions that's listed out there. There's a question listed for Dr. Zhu, but I'm going to ask that question both to Dr. Zhu and to Professor Sutter also. Let me read that out. The question was, Dr. Zhu, you recently commented that both the US and China are skeptical of each other, holding to their stated commitments on issues related to Taiwan. We're talking about the Taiwan question here. So what are the possible ways to try and build mutual trust on not only Taiwan, but other red lines? Let's focus more on the Taiwan. How do we build trust on the Taiwan issue? If I could go to you, Dr. Zhu, first, and then to you, Dr. Sutter.
Well, this is very difficult because, both the United States and China, the domestic issues are the priorities. I don't think, Xi Jinping or Biden will wake up in the morning and say, gee, we got to do something about Taiwan today, right? I think they are pulled in different directions by domestic issues. The trust, yes, that's something lacking between two sides. I think the gap is so huge on this particular issue that I remain pessimistic. I don't think, there's an easy solution how they can keep their commitment. For the PRC, of course, the long-standing policy has been peaceful reunification, and that has been repeatedly stated, even including in the 20th Party Congress report. But then, of course, the People's Liberation Army has been modernized, and in recent years, China has this tendency to use coercive measures, including military measures, to add pressure on Taiwan. And sometimes the PRC wants to punish or penalize the DPP government through military means. Then, of course, you're doing the opposite. It's counterproductive. So how do you reconcile this contradiction, right? Peaceful unification, but maintain this military pressure or kind of to punish the DPP? It's a dilemma. I don't think Beijing has an easy answer to that question. For the United States, of course, what exactly is one China, right? I think the problem here is that Washington has different, separate commitments to Beijing and Taipei, and they are contradictory. Washington keeps saying that our One China policy is different from China's One China principle, which is true. But what exactly is Taiwan's status under America's One China policy? It's confusing. It's ambiguous, And based on the Six Assurances, it seems like, and also Taiwan Relations Act, it seems like the United States is treating Taiwan as a separate political entity, not going to be ruled by the PRC. That seems to be the U.S. commitment to the Taiwanese. But then, of course, according to the 3 communiques between the PRC and the United States, United States acknowledges Chinese position that Taiwan is part of China, and the United States will take no position, regarding the future of cross-strait relations. If they are going to unify, then we're fine, right? But again, how the United States can strictly follow this One China and clearly send then signals to Beijing and Taipei that this is very difficult, and I don't think there's any easy solution to that problem. Maybe Professor Sutter has a better solution. Thank you.
I'd love to be put in the spotlight on this type of thing, but I agree very much that there's no way of dealing with this kind of settlement that Professor Zhu is talking about. But they do agree they don't want to go to war over Taiwan. I think that's very clear, and I think that's a basis to work on. Okay, we have these. You disagree with us, and we disagree with you, and but we don't want to fight over this issue because that would be, there's no way of reducing the escalation capacity of that kind of war. And so, so the result is, I think you can, on that basis, you can reach understandings where the one side or the other will say, look, you go well in this area, this is going to really endanger the situation. Say this in private, but this is not something you would say in public. And Xi Jinping has intervened several times with U.S. presidents on sensitive issues. He did it with Trump, he did it with Biden. I think he could intervene in something like this. You do this, this is going to be a real problem for us. And we can do the same to them. And that'll keep it from going to war. The disputes won't be settled at all. I think the goals are very different. And as Professor Zhu has emphasized, But I think we can, this is where the guardrails come in. This is why both sides want guardrails. Great. I think that'll keep it from going to war. So that's the basis. It's a very crude basis, but I think that's what where we can work together on.
Thank you. I'm going to extend out the session by just about 5 minutes because we still have some questions. Dr. Sutter, I will come to you with the last question, but I'm going to come to Denis next for a question. But I just want to keep you flagged that I'm going to come to you with the question, the last question, which would be, we have a question says, what role should Congress play concerning U.S.-China relations 2023? I'm going to ask you the question as to what role do you expect Congress to play in U.S.-China relations in 2023. But before that, let me come to you, Denis. We have questions for you. I want to club two questions together. The question is, Mr. Simon, you mentioned a number of changes that you noticed in your recent visit, in your last visit. Was there a shift in your eyes of common attitudes in China towards the U.S. and the Americans? And can I also club that with the other question, which is there, which says that without U.S.-China collaboration, significant global issues will not be tackled. And the question is, are there specific big signature projects or programs that could focus both countries on their shared interest? If you could just club those and answer that quickly.
Okay, very well. I did not yet notice, at least in the people who I talked to, a negative shift, towards the United States. But there clearly is emerging a separation between how the government in the United States is viewed and how people are viewed. And I think that the emphasis on people-to-people diplomacy, people-to-people connectivity, it continues to indicate that there's a feeling of friendship between the peoples of the two countries. And I think there's a sense that if only the governments could figure out how to work together, we would be in a better position. But I do worry if we continue along the current track that in fact that some of that negativity will begin to increase, more broadly speaking. And I've heard a couple of PRC students on campus here in the United States begin to espouse more critical views, as if the United States, in fact, is trying to contain China. And I think if that idea of broader containment economically and technologically does begin to become the perception, I think that could not bode very well for positive thinking about the U.S.-China relationship. In terms of the issues that we need to focus on, I have two pet issues that I think are important, and they're in the area of global health. So first thing that we know is that there's going to be another pandemic. We may not know what it is, but there's going to be another one, and we ought to have a crisis emergency team, bilateral team being put together, if not a multilateral team being prepared to work together on how to deal with this. But there are two major diseases, cancer and Alzheimer's disease. Cancer, because it's becoming a big global problem as industrialization proceeds in the emerging market countries as well. And brain science, which is a big project both in the U.S. and the United States, but in China. But pretty soon, China is going to have the world's largest number of people suffering from Alzheimer's disease. And so there's a great interest in China in preemption and early detection so that they can prevent the spread of Alzheimer's as rapidly as it is occurring. And we have similar joint interests in the United States. I would think that those are two areas in particular that we could do some great work together for the benefit not of only both countries and the people within them, but also other countries all around the world. And I would highlight those two.
Yeah. Final question to you, Professor Sutter, on where do you think Congress will be on U.S.-China relations in 2023?
Well, obviously, the House going Republican will reinforce to some degree the Washington consensus. But this Washington consensus is, as you indicated earlier, is very bipartisan. It's been with us for a long time, and a lot of Democrats liberal Democrats are very down on China for other reasons. What could happen is that the Republican majorities could be very disruptive. In other words, they would, as Professor Leo talked about the investigation of Hunter Biden and this type of thing, that could be divisive and partisan and basically counterproductive. But I'm pretty optimistic that that's not going to get a lot of traction. I really have a lot of, I'm watching the mainstream Republicans in the Senate is something that I think they won't like this kind of disruption. They want a much more systematic way of dealing with China, and they've been passing these laws, cooperating with the president, with the Democrats to get them through, and other restrictions. And so I think that I'm just not sure how this is going to work within the Republican Party. There are these hardliners in the who are seeking publicity, who could be disruptive. But I think it's going to be bounded because I think the Senate is not going to go along with this at all. I think they're look at Senator Cornyn. You know, he's somebody who I think is just right there in the middle of this cooperation to focused on China, see it as a real danger, and we have to do things that work together to counter the danger. The danger of China is very important to understand this. The Washington Consensus has felt this danger of China. I'm summarizing, but it's basically they fear a lot of different things, but they worry about China dominating Asia. That's really seen as a big danger. And the second thing is China dominating the high technology industries, which would dominate the economy and would dominate the military as well. So these things of domination that they're concerned about are very serious. And so stunts and partisan posturing doesn't fit very well when you're dealing with a lot of people who said, look, we got to really deal with this issue right now, and we have to deal with it constructively. So I think that mindset, I think, will prevail among the Senate Republicans, I think very much so, and I think probably a lot of the Republicans in the House as well.
Thank you, Professor. Yeah, go ahead, please, Dennis. One quickly.
Yeah, I just one closing comment. I found it interesting. We just spent about an hour and a half on U.S. China relations, and the term human rights did not come up once. So it shows you where we are in terms of our relationship. That used to be the showstopper in many cases. Now we've got so many other issues that are also on the agenda that one seems to have faded a bit, even though obviously it's a critically important issue in the relationship.
It's not an existential threat.
Right.
And the high tech is, and the dominance in Asia is. I'm making my own judgment on this, but this one is governance is very important, but it's not an existential threat.
Right.
Sure. Thank you to all the panelists. I know we have more questions out there in the box, but we've overrun our time and overrun it by 8 minutes. So I'm going to close out this session. I just wanted to thank all the panelists, Yawei, Denis, Professor Sutter, Dr. Zhiqun, you all have been terrific, and this has been a very engaging conversation. I hope to have you all back again discussing U.S.-China relations at a future event, but thank you for your contributions today. And I hope it has been illuminating to our audience also. Thanks all, and see you again soon at our next event. Bye.
Thanks very much.
Bye-bye.